Chapter 1. A Star is Born. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on a quiet March morning. But who could have known the world he would change? The year was 1853. The morning air was crisp, and the village of Zundert in the Netherlands was calm. In a modest brick house, Anna van Gogh held her newborn son. She whispered softly, "Vincent Willem van Gogh," as her husband Theodorus watched proudly. No one in that room could imagine that this small baby would one day become one of the most famous painters in history. Vincent grew up surrounded by fields, flowers, and quiet streets. The landscape of Zundert was peaceful, with rows of trees lining the narrow roads. He loved to explore nature, his small feet running through the grass, his eyes wide with wonder at the world around him. "Look at the clouds," he would shout, or, "The flowers are so yellow." Nature spoke to Vincent in ways words could not. But life at home was not always peaceful. His father, a strict pastor, believed in discipline and hard work. "Vincent, sit up straight," his father would say during family prayers. His mother, although gentle, expected him to behave properly. Vincent often felt pressure to be the perfect son, but he wasn't. He was different, sensitive, emotional, and easily distracted. At school, things were no better. Vincent found it hard to focus. The other children teased him, calling him the quiet boy or the strange one. He would often sit alone, sketching pictures in the dirt or staring out the window. One day, when a teacher scolded him for daydreaming, Vincent muttered under his breath, "Why can't they see what I see?" When he was just 11, Vincent had to leave home and attend a boarding school far away. The separation from his family made him lonely. He missed the familiar smell of his mother's cooking and the sight of his father reading in his study. He wrote letters home, begging to return, but his parents insisted he stay. "You'll grow stronger this way," they said. But Vincent only felt weaker, more alone. He found comfort in the world outside the classroom. He would walk for hours, observing the birds, the rivers, and the changing skies. Art became his secret refuge. He would sketch simple drawings of trees, animals, and anything that caught his attention. Although they were rough, these drawings held something special, a passion hidden behind every line. One afternoon, while visiting his uncle's home, Vincent saw a painting that would change him forever. It was a simple picture of a farmer working in the field. The man's face was rough and tired, but there was a quiet beauty in the scene. Vincent couldn't take his eyes off it. How can a picture say so much without words? He wondered. His heart raced. Something inside him clicked, a spark that would later become a flame. Despite his growing love for art, Vincent didn't tell anyone about it. His family expected him to follow a respectable career. His father hoped he would become a pastor, like him. His mother thought he might work in business. Art seemed like a childish dream. But in Vincent's mind, it was more than a dream. It was his escape. By the time he turned 16, Vincent had grown into a quiet, thoughtful teenager. His hair was messy, his clothes were often untidy, and his eyes had a distant, almost haunted look. People said he was strange, but Vincent didn't mind. He had a world inside him that no one else could see. A world filled with color, emotion, and meaning. One evening, as he watched the sun set behind the fields of Zundert, Vincent whispered to himself, "There's more out there. I can feel it." The orange sky seemed to reflect his hidden desires. He didn't know where life would take him, but something deep inside told him he was meant for more. Little did he know. His journey had just begun. Chapter 2. A Wandering Soul. Vincent couldn't stay in one place. Something restless pulled him forward. Vincent van Gogh's young adulthood was a journey of trial and error. He was searching for purpose, but couldn't find it. His restless spirit pushed him from one job to another, one city to the next. Each time he thought, "This will be it. This will be where I belong." But it never was. At 16, he began working at his uncle's art gallery in The Hague. The gallery sold paintings to wealthy clients, and Vincent was surrounded by beautiful artwork. At first, he was excited. "This is perfect," he thought. "I love art." But working in the gallery was different from making art. He spent long hours standing behind a counter, showing paintings he had no connection to. His smile was forced. His interest faded. The job took him to London, where he hoped for a fresh start. London was noisy and crowded, filled with opportunity. But something felt wrong. Vincent was lonely. He walked along the foggy streets and stared at the grand buildings. "This isn't my place," he whispered. His job bored him, and his heart grew heavy. After 2 years, he quit. He returned home to the Netherlands. His family, worried about his lack of direction, suggested teaching. Vincent agreed and became a teacher at a boarding school. But his mind wandered during lessons. He didn't care about grammar or history. Instead, he sketched pictures of students when they weren't looking. The job didn't last. In desperation, Vincent turned to religion. His father, a pastor, was thrilled. Maybe this would bring his troubled son peace. Vincent studied the Bible day and night. He memorized verses and prayed with passion. He thought he had found his calling. "God will guide me," he said. He trained to become a preacher and moved to the Borinage, a poor coal mining region in Belgium, to work as a missionary. The Borinage was bleak and gray. The skies were heavy with coal dust, and the miners' faces were dark with soot. Vincent was shocked by their suffering. The miners worked long hours underground, their hands rough, their lungs sick. Many families lived in small, cold houses with barely enough food. Vincent felt their pain as if it were his own. He gave away most of his belongings, his warm clothes, his bedding, and even his money. He handed them to the miners without hesitation. "They need it more than I do," he told himself. He lived like they did, eating simple bread and sleeping on the floor. But despite his kindness, Vincent wasn't a successful preacher. His sermons were awkward, and his words didn't inspire the miners. The church dismissed him after only a year. Devastated, Vincent sat alone in his small room. The walls were bare, and the wind howled outside. He had failed again. "What is wrong with me?" he thought. "Why can't I find my place in the world?" He stared at his hands, calloused and dirty. Then, his eyes fell on a piece of charcoal lying on the floor. Slowly, he picked it up. Without thinking, he began to draw. He sketched a miner's tired face, capturing the wrinkles and sadness in his eyes. The lines were rough, but there was something real in them, something powerful. His heart beat faster. He couldn't stop drawing. He drew the miner's boots, their hands, their tools. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. When he finally stopped, his fingers were black with charcoal. He smiled for the first time in months. This feels right," he said softly. For the first time, Vincent realized that art wasn't just something he liked. It was something he needed. It was his way of expressing the emotions he couldn't put into words. The joy, the pain, the confusion, all of it could live on the page. From that moment, his path began to change. He knew he wanted to be an artist, but this new journey would not be easy. He had no formal training, no mentor, and no financial support. His family was confused and disappointed. "You'll never make a living as an artist," his father warned. But Vincent's mind was made up. "I would rather fail at something I love," he replied, "than succeed at something I don't." His wandering had brought him here. It had taken years of searching, but finally he had found a spark. He didn't know where it would lead him, but he was ready to follow it. And so, the young man who couldn't stay in one place had found a purpose that would carry him for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. Finding his brushstrokes. Vincent's hands shook as he picked up the brush. "I must paint," he whispered. Vincent van Gogh stood alone in a small, dim room. The light from the window fell across the wooden floor. In front of him sat a blank canvas. His heart pounded. His fingers trembled as he held the brush. "This is it," he thought. "This is where my life begins." But Vincent didn't become a great painter overnight. The road was long, filled with failures, frustration, and doubt. He had no formal art education. Everything he knew, he had learned by observing the world around him. And he wanted more. "I must practice every day," he said, "until the lines speak for me." He started with simple drawings. His hands were rough, but his eyes were sharp. He studied everything: trees bending in the wind, faces wrinkled with time, and hands hardened by labor. He spent hours sketching peasants at work, their bodies bent over fields or washing clothes by the river. He saw beauty in their struggle. To Vincent, their lives were stories waiting to be told. One cold morning, he visited a farm. The air smelled of wet soil, and frost clung to the ground. A woman in a thick, worn coat stood outside, peeling potatoes. Vincent watched as her fingers moved quickly, dirt sticking to her hands. Without asking, he pulled out his sketchbook. The woman glanced at him and smiled. "Why would anyone draw someone like me?" she asked. Vincent's eyes softened. Because you are real, he replied. He worked tirelessly, filling his sketchbooks with scenes of life in the countryside. He admired the old masters, Rembrandt, Millet, and others who painted the simple beauty of everyday people. Vincent copied their works, not to steal their ideas, but to learn their techniques. He studied how light touched a face, how shadows fell across the floor, and how hands could show emotion without words. Despite his passion, progress was slow. His early paintings were dark, full of browns and grays. He didn't yet know how to make colors come alive. He felt stuck, unsure of himself. Am I good enough? He wondered late at night, staring at his unfinished canvases. The silence of the room seemed to answer him with doubt, but Vincent refused to give up. I will get better, he told himself. I just need time. One of his first major works was The Potato Eaters, a painting of a poor peasant family gathered around a table. Their faces were tired, their hands rough from hard work. They ate their simple meal, potatoes, with a sense of quiet dignity. Vincent wanted the world to see their struggles and their strength. They deserve to be remembered, he said, not as poor people, but as humans with stories. When the painting was finished, Vincent stepped back and stared at it for a long time. The room was silent, except for the sound of his breathing. He knew it wasn't perfect. The brushstrokes were heavy and the colors were dark. But the emotion was there. The honesty, the struggle, the life of the people he painted. It's a beginning, he whispered. But not everyone saw what Vincent saw. When he showed his work to others, they often frowned. Some said the colors were too dull. Others said the figures looked awkward. You should try painting pretty things, one man suggested. Vincent forced a smile, but felt a sharp pain inside. Pretty things? That wasn't his mission. His mission was to paint what was real, even if it wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. Still, the criticism hurt. At night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Why don't they understand? He thought. But then, his mind drifted back to the peasants he had drawn, to their tired eyes and strong hands. He remembered the woman peeling potatoes and how she smiled when he drew her. They understand, he thought, and that's enough. To improve, Vincent decided to leave his small village and seek guidance. He traveled to cities where he could visit museums and learn from other artists. He experimented with brighter colors, looser brushstrokes, and new techniques. He painted flowers, landscapes, and portraits, always pushing himself to do more. Each brushstroke became a step towards something greater. One day, as he stood by a river, Vincent noticed the sunlight reflecting on the water. The colors danced, gold, blue, and green. His breath caught in his throat. He dipped his brush into his paints and began to work. His hand moved faster than usual, as if the colors were guiding him. When he stepped back, he smiled. The colors weren't perfect, but they were alive. I'm beginning to find it, he thought. My voice, my brushstrokes. Vincent's passion for painting became unstoppable. He painted when the sun rose and kept working long after it set. His clothes were often stained with paint, and his hands never seemed clean. But he didn't care. He was on a journey, and nothing could stop him. In time, his paintings would evolve, becoming brighter and bolder. But for now, Vincent was focused on learning, on experimenting, and on telling the stories of the people and places around him. As he cleaned his brushes one evening, he whispered to himself, "One day, my work will be worth something, not in money, but in meaning." He had no idea how true those words would become. Chapter 4. The Colors of Paris. The streets of Paris buzzed with life and color, and Vincent's heart raced to keep up. In 1886, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris. He stepped off the train, breathing in the cool air. His eyes scanned the busy streets, filled with carriages, bicycles, and street vendors shouting about their goods. He tightened his grip on his suitcase and smiled. "This is where things will change," he whispered. Paris was alive. The streets hummed with energy. Music drifted out of cafes, and artists painted on sidewalks. In the crowded neighborhoods of Montmartre, art wasn't just in museums, it was everywhere. Vincent was overwhelmed but excited. The gray and brown tones of his past paintings faded from his mind. Here, the world was bursting with color. He moved into an apartment with his brother, Theo. Theo worked as an art dealer and knew many painters in the city. He introduced Vincent to some of the most important artists of the time, including Toulouse-Lautrec, Seurat, and Paul Gauguin. Each artist had a unique style, and Vincent studied their work closely. He admired how they played with light, shadow, and bold, bright colors. One evening, Theo invited a group of artists to their home. The room was filled with conversation, laughter, and the smell of wine. Vincent, sitting quietly at first, listened to the others debate about art. Some preferred soft, realistic landscapes. Others, like Toulouse-Lautrec, loved bold lines and exaggerated forms. Eventually, Vincent joined the discussion. "Art should speak to the soul," he said. "It should make people feel something, not just look beautiful." The next day, he visited the galleries of Paris. He stood in front of paintings by Monet and Renoir, two of the most famous Impressionists. Their work was nothing like the dark, heavy pieces Vincent had painted before. They used soft brushstrokes and vibrant colors to capture the movement of light. A field of flowers seemed to sway in the breeze. A river sparkled under the afternoon sun. Vincent's heart beat faster. He wanted to learn everything. But learning was not easy. He had to unlearn many habits. His old paintings, filled with shadows and dull tones, no longer felt right. He began experimenting, mixing colors and painting faster. He painted flowers, streets, cafes, and portraits of people he met. His brushstrokes became loose and lively. His palette brightened with yellows, reds and blues jumping off the canvas. One of his favorite subjects was the Montmartre neighborhood. He painted windmills on the hill, bustling markets, and women in bright dresses walking past flower shops. The sunlight seemed different here, warmer and more alive. He captured it with broad, quick strokes, as if he were racing against time. But Vincent's excitement came at a cost. The noise of the city, the pressure to succeed, and the constant competition among artists began to wear him down. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts raced. Am I good enough? He wondered. He saw paintings by other artists selling for large sums of money, but his own work went unnoticed. Doubt crept in. Sometimes he would take long walks along the Seine River, watching the boats pass by. The water calmed him, but the feeling never lasted long. As soon as he returned to the apartment, the weight of the city pressed on him again. He felt trapped by expectations, by failure, and by his own mind. Theo tried to comfort him. Your time will come, he said. Keep painting. Vincent nodded, but inside he felt lost. His emotions swung wildly between hope and despair. Some days he painted with energy and passion, creating several pieces in a single afternoon. Other days he couldn't lift his brush. He would sit by the window, watching the world outside, feeling like he didn't belong. One of the few people who understood him was Paul Gauguin. The two artists became close friends, sharing ideas and dreams. They both believed in creating art that showed emotion, not just beauty. But their friendship was complicated. Gauguin's confidence sometimes clashed with Vincent's sensitivity. Arguments erupted, but their connection remained strong, for now. Despite his struggles, Vincent's art was transforming. He painted still lifes with sunflowers, filling the canvas with bold yellows and swirling greens. His portraits of cafe workers and street musicians had rough, thick brushstrokes, full of life and movement. He painted what he felt, not just what he saw. And for the first time, he felt like he was creating something uniquely his. One evening, as he finished a painting of a woman sitting by a window, he leaned back and smiled. The colors seemed to glow under the dim light of his studio. I'm getting closer, he thought, closer to what I want. But deep inside, the pressure was building. His restless spirit, his self-doubt, and the fast pace of city life created a storm within him. The bright colors that had once inspired him now felt overwhelming. The noise of Paris was no longer exciting. It was exhausting. After 2 years in the city, Vincent knew it was time to leave. He packed his bags and said goodbye to Theo, promising to write. He didn't know exactly where he would go, but he knew he needed peace, a place where he could hear his own thoughts again. As the train pulled away from Paris, he looked out the window and whispered, "Thank you." The city had given him color, friends, and lessons he would never forget. But now he needed something more. He was searching for a new beginning. Chapter 5. Letters to Theo. Dear Theo, I feel trapped, "But your words are my light," Vincent wrote. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Vincent's pen scratching across the paper. His hand moved quickly, as if the words had been waiting to escape. He stopped, read what he had written, and sighed. Then he dipped the pen back into the ink and continued. "Dear Theo," he wrote. It always began that way. No matter where Vincent was, Paris, Arles, or a small room in an asylum, his letters to Theo were his lifeline. They were filled with everything, his struggles, dreams, and fears. Sometimes they were pages long, other times just a few lines, but they always carried his deepest thoughts. Theo van Gogh wasn't just Vincent's brother. He was his best friend, his protector, and in many ways his only connection to the world. While others doubted Vincent's talent, Theo believed in him. He sent money when Vincent couldn't afford food or paint. He offered advice when Vincent felt lost. Most importantly, Theo listened, even when Vincent's words were hard to hear. In one letter, Vincent confessed, "I feel trapped. My mind won't stop racing. The colors, the images, they're too much. But when I read your letters, I find a small light. It's like you're standing next to me, telling me to keep going." Theo, always patient, replied with gentle encouragement. "You have a gift, Vincent," he wrote. "Even if the world doesn't see it yet, I do. Keep painting. One day, they will understand." But their relationship wasn't always easy. Vincent's mood could change like the wind. One day, he was hopeful, excited about a new painting. The next, he was angry, frustrated that no one appreciated his work. He would lash out in letters, accusing Theo of not doing enough to sell his art. "Why am I still struggling?" he wrote once. "Isn't it your job to help me succeed?" Theo rarely responded with anger. Instead, he reminded Vincent of the progress he had made. He praised his latest works and promised that success would come. But even Theo had his limits. Sometimes he felt the weight of Vincent's emotional storms. "I want to help you, Vincent," Theo wrote in one letter. "But you must help yourself, too. Take care of your health. Rest when you need to." Vincent tried to listen, but his mind was restless. He couldn't stop thinking about art. "I paint because I must," he once wrote. "Even when my hands shake or my heart aches, I cannot stop. There's something inside me, something that won't let me rest." When Vincent moved to Arles, he wrote to Theo almost every day. He described the golden fields of wheat, the warm light of the sun, and the vibrant flowers that seemed to dance in the breeze. "The colors here are like nothing I've ever seen," he wrote. "I feel alive when I paint them." But he also shared his loneliness. He had dreamed of creating an artist community in Arles, but few artists came. Even Paul Gauguin, who had stayed for a brief time, left after their friendship fell apart. Vincent was left alone with his thoughts, and those thoughts were often dark. In one letter, Vincent admitted, "Sometimes I hear voices. They tell me I'm a failure, that I'll never be remembered. I try to drown them out by painting, but they always come back." His words were heavy, filled with pain. Theo, reading them miles away, felt his heart break. He wanted to reach through the paper and pull his brother out of the darkness. Despite the distance between them, Theo never abandoned Vincent. He kept writing. He sent money for paint and canvases. He encouraged Vincent to exhibit his work, even when galleries refused to show it. Theo's letters were like a steady hand on Vincent's shoulder, guiding him forward. When Vincent painted the starry night, he described it to Theo with excitement. "I couldn't sleep," he wrote. "The night sky called to me. I had to capture it, the swirling stars, the deep blue, the movement of it all. It felt like magic." Theo's response was simple but powerful. "It's beautiful. Keep painting what you feel." As Vincent's mental health worsened, his letters became more emotional. He often apologized for his behavior. "I know I'm difficult," he wrote. "I don't mean to be. I feel too much. My mind is too loud." Theo reassured him, as always. "You are not a burden," he wrote. "You are my brother. I will always be here." In 1890, Vincent's final letter to Theo was different. It had a sense of calm, as if he had made peace with something. "I have done my best," he wrote. "I have worked hard. I hope my paintings will mean something one day, even if I'm not here to see it." Not long after, Vincent's life ended. When Theo received the news, he was devastated. The letters they had shared now became precious memories, a record of a bond that could never be broken. Theo kept every one of them, rereading Vincent's words whenever he missed him. Years later, those letters would help the world understand Vincent van Gogh, the artist and the man. Through them, we see his passion, his struggles, and his unbreakable connection to the brother who never gave up on him. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, Dreams of Arles. Arles. The light here feels like fire on my skin, Vincent said in awe. The train ride to Arles was long, but Vincent didn't mind. He watched the changing scenery with wide eyes. The gray cities faded into the distance, replaced by open fields, olive trees, and endless skies. When he stepped off the train, the warm sun hit his face. He smiled. This was the south of France, where the light was golden, and the colors seemed to glow. Vincent had big dreams for Arles. He wanted to create an artists' community, a place where painters could live, work, and inspire each other. The idea filled him with excitement. Here, I will find peace, he thought. Here, my art will flourish. He rented a small yellow house on the corner of a quiet street. Its shutters were old and the paint was peeling, but to Vincent, it was perfect. He imagined artists gathering around a table, talking about color, technique, and life. He pictured them painting the landscapes together and filling the house with art. But for now, the house was empty. Just Vincent and his dreams. The town of Arles charmed him. Its narrow streets, stone houses, and lively markets reminded him of the paintings he had seen in books. The people were simple, but kind. Vincent often wandered through the fields, watching farmers at work. He marveled at the way the sunlight touched the wheat, making it shimmer like gold. "I must paint this," he said to himself. He worked from morning until night, often forgetting to eat. He painted fields of sunflowers, their bright yellow petals reaching for the sky. He painted orchards, their trees bursting with pink and white blossoms. He painted the small cafes and bridges that dotted the town. His brushstrokes were fast, full of energy and life. The colors on his canvas seemed to vibrate. "This is what I was meant to do," he whispered. One of his most famous works during this time was sunflowers. He painted them in vases with their petals curling and leaves drooping. To some, they looked simple, but to Vincent, they were alive. "These flowers have soul," he wrote to Theo. "They are bright, but there is sadness in them too, just like life." But despite the beauty around him, Vincent's heart grew heavy. His dream of an artist's community was still just that, a dream. Paul Gauguin, the artist Vincent admired most, had agreed to come, but he hadn't arrived yet. The waiting was unbearable. Vincent felt lonely, like a ship lost at sea. The silence of the house echoed his thoughts. "I can't do this alone," he wrote to Theo. "I need someone to share this with." The people of Arles were polite, but they didn't understand Vincent. They thought he was strange. He wore tattered clothes, spoke passionately about art, and often wandered the streets at odd hours. Children giggled when they saw him. Some called him the mad painter. Vincent tried to ignore them, but their whispers stayed with him. As the days passed, his mood shifted. Some mornings, he woke up eager to paint, filled with hope. Other days, he stayed in bed, trapped by his own mind. His thoughts raced. Was he wasting his time here? Would his dream ever come true? He painted through the pain, as if the colors could heal him. Then, finally, Gauguin arrived. Vincent greeted him with open arms, showing him the yellow house and the paintings he had completed. "We will do great things here," Vincent exclaimed. Gauguin smiled, but there was hesitation in his eyes. He admired Vincent's passion, but their differences quickly became clear. Vincent wanted to paint from emotion, capturing what he felt, not just what he saw. Gauguin preferred structure and control. Their arguments began as small disagreements, but grew more heated with time. One evening after a long day of painting, their voices echoed through the house. "You don't understand," Vincent shouted. "Art is not about perfection. It's about feeling." Gauguin, frustrated, packed his bags. The artist community Vincent had dreamed of was falling apart before it had even begun. As Gauguin left, Vincent stood at the doorway, watching the man disappear into the night. His hands trembled. Tears filled his eyes. That night, the loneliness returned stronger than ever. The yellow house felt colder, darker. In a moment of despair, Vincent's mind spiraled. He grabbed a razor and, in an act of pain and confusion, injured himself, cutting part of his ear. Blood stained the floor as he stumbled through the house, calling out for help. Neighbors found him and rushed him to the hospital. Lying in the hospital bed, Vincent stared at the ceiling. The light from the window was soft, but it felt distant. He had come to Arles with so much hope, but now everything seemed broken. When Theo heard the news, he wrote Vincent a letter filled with love and encouragement. "Don't give up," he pleaded. "Rest, heal. You are stronger than you think." Vincent recovered slowly, but the pain in his heart remained. He continued to paint, even from his hospital bed. The colors were still there, bright, warm, and alive. Despite everything, his passion never left him. "I will keep painting," he told himself. "Even if the world doesn't understand, I do." Arles had given him inspiration, but it had also taken a piece of him. Yet through the loneliness, the rejection, and the pain, Vincent held on to his dream. The sunflowers still bloomed. Chapter 7. A friend, a fight, a fall. "Paul Gauguin is coming," Vincent said with joy, but it would not last. It was autumn in Arles. The leaves fell gently from the trees, carried by the cool breeze. Vincent stood by the window of the yellow house, watching the world outside. His hands trembled with excitement. "He's coming," he whispered to himself. Paul Gauguin, the painter Vincent admired, had finally agreed to visit. Vincent had waited months for this moment. His letters to Theo were filled with hope. "Gauguin will understand me," he wrote. "Together, we can create something great." He believed that with Gauguin's help, the artist's community he dreamed of could begin. Vincent cleaned the house, bought fresh flowers, and prepared the guest room. Everything had to be perfect. When Gauguin arrived, Vincent's face lit up. "Welcome to Arles," he said, embracing his friend. The two artists walked through the town, exploring the markets, fields, and cafes. Vincent showed Gauguin his latest paintings: sunflowers, orchards, and portraits. Gauguin nodded in approval, but said little. Vincent didn't mind. He was simply happy to have someone by his side. At first, their time together was inspiring. They painted together during the day and discussed art late into the night. They debated techniques, color, and emotion. Vincent believed art should come from the heart, raw and full of feeling. Gauguin preferred discipline and structure. "You must control your brush," Gauguin said. "Don't let emotion take over." Vincent disagreed. "Emotion is everything," he replied. "A painting should breathe. It should make people feel alive." Their differences became more obvious as days turned into weeks. Gauguin was confident, calm, and collected. Vincent was emotional, passionate, and unpredictable. Their conversations, once exciting, became tense. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments. The walls of the yellow house seemed to close in on them. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Vincent and Gauguin sat in the small kitchen. The air was thick with silence. Suddenly, Gauguin placed his cup on the table and said, "I'm leaving soon." Vincent's eyes widened. "Leaving? But why?" "I can't stay here," Gauguin replied. "We see the world too differently. It's exhausting." Vincent's chest tightened. His mind raced. "Please," he begged, "don't go. We can fix this." But Gauguin shook his head. "I need space, Vincent. This isn't working." The next day, Vincent followed Gauguin through the streets of Arles, pleading with him to stay. His words were desperate, his voice breaking. "You're my only friend," he shouted. Gauguin didn't respond. He kept walking, his footsteps steady, while Vincent's heart crumbled. That night, Vincent returned to the yellow house, alone and defeated. His emotions overwhelmed him. Anger, sadness, and confusion mixed together like a storm. He paced the room, clutching his head. His thoughts spiraled out of control. "Why am I like this?" he whispered. "Why does everyone leave?" In a moment of madness, Vincent grabbed a razor. Tears streamed down his face as he cut into his own ear. Blood dripped onto the floor, staining the wooden boards. The pain was sharp, but it didn't stop him. It was as if the physical pain was the only way to quiet the storm inside his mind. With his ear wrapped in a cloth, Vincent stumbled out into the night. The streets of Arles were silent, the moonlight casting shadows on the walls. He made his way to a nearby house where a woman he knew lived. Shivering and weak, he handed her the bloody cloth. "Take this," he said softly. Then he collapsed. The news spread quickly through the town. "The mad painter has hurt himself," people whispered. Vincent was taken to the hospital, where doctors bandaged his wound and monitored his condition. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind foggy. When he was awake, he stared at the ceiling, wondering how things had gone so wrong. Theo arrived as soon as he heard the news. He sat by Vincent's bed, holding his hand. "I'm here," Theo said. "You're going to be okay." Vincent's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to do it," he whispered. "I just wanted the pain to stop." Theo nodded, his heart breaking. He didn't know what to say. He could only be there, offering the quiet comfort that Vincent needed. As Vincent slowly recovered, he reflected on his time with Gauguin. He still believed in the dream of an artist's community, but the reality had been different. He realized that not everyone saw the world the way he did. Not everyone could stay by his side. But Vincent also knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up painting. "The world may not understand me," he said to himself, "but I will keep painting. It's the only thing that makes sense." After a few weeks, he returned to the yellow house. The room where he and Gauguin had once talked about art now felt empty. But Vincent didn't let the sadness consume him. He picked up his brush and began to paint. His strokes were strong, full of determination. His pain didn't disappear. It lived in the lines of his paintings, in the swirls of color on the canvas. The sunflowers still bloomed in his imagination. The fields of wheat still called to him. And even though his heart ached, his art remained alive. Gauguin had left, but Vincent's story was far from over. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Mind. Vincent could no longer tell the difference between dreams and nightmares. The air in Saint-Remy was cool, with the smell of lavender drifting through the breeze. But inside the stone walls of the asylum, the air felt heavy. Vincent sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His mind was a maze, twisting paths of confusion, fear, and sadness. Some days, he didn't know where he was. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Or something in between? The doctors kept him under close watch. "Rest," they said. "No painting for now." But Vincent couldn't rest. The silence of the room was louder than any noise. His thoughts raced, crashing into each other like waves during a storm. At night, he tossed and turned, his mind filled with strange visions. "Why won't it stop?" he whispered into the darkness. One morning, he looked out the window of the asylum. Beyond the tall stone walls, fields stretched toward the horizon. The wind blew gently, bending the trees. In the distance, he saw a cypress tree standing tall, its dark shape cutting through the sky. The sky itself was a swirl of blue and white, like a living, breathing thing. His fingers itched for a brush. "I need to paint," he told the doctor. "It's the only way to calm my mind." After some time, the doctors agreed. They gave him a small studio within the asylum. It had plain walls and a wooden table, but to Vincent, it was a sanctuary. He gathered his paints, brushes, and canvas. As soon as he touched the brush to the canvas, the noise in his head softened. His hands moved quickly, as if they were guided by something beyond him. He painted the starry night, a swirling vision of the night sky over Saint-Remy. The stars glowed like lanterns, scattered across the deep blue. The cypress tree reached up like a shadow, mysterious and dark. The moon, bright and full, cast its light over the village below. But this wasn't a realistic scene. It was a dream, a world shaped by emotion. Vincent poured his feelings into every stroke, the chaos, the longing, and the quiet moments of peace. As he worked, his breathing slowed. For the first time in weeks, his mind felt lighter. When he finished, he stepped back and stared at the painting. His heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from awe. "This is my mind on canvas," he thought. "The beauty and the madness." But his relief didn't last long. The shadows returned, creeping into his thoughts. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of the world rested on his chest. He heard voices that weren't there. whispers telling him he was a failure. Tears would fall, but he didn't know why. He wrote to Theo, describing the pain that wouldn't go away. "I feel trapped," he said. "The light is so far away." Theo wrote back with words of comfort. "Keep painting, Vincent," he encouraged. "Your art will guide you." And so, Vincent painted. He painted the gardens of the asylum, filled with vibrant irises and sunflowers. The flowers seemed to burst with life, their petals bright and full of color. He painted them not as they were, but as he felt them, alive, moving, reaching toward the light. He painted olive trees bending in the wind, their twisted trunks telling stories of strength and survival. But even as he created masterpieces, Vincent struggled. The episodes of madness came and went, like storms that couldn't be predicted. One moment, he was calm, focused on the canvas. The next, he was lost in fear, unable to recognize his surroundings. The doctors did what they could, but mental illness in those days had few treatments. Vincent had to fight most of the battle on his own. Despite his suffering, he remained determined. "I will not stop," he told himself. "Even if my mind betrays me, my hands will keep working." He painted self-portraits, capturing the exhaustion in his eyes and the lines on his face. In each portrait, his emotions were raw: pain, hope, and a spark of something deeper. One day, he walked through the garden, watching the sun cast shadows on the ground. He bent down and touched a flower, its petals soft beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth of the sun on his face. For a brief moment, the storm inside him quieted. "There is still beauty," he whispered, "even in the darkest places." As the months passed, Vincent's condition remained unstable, but through it all, he kept painting. His studio was filled with works that captured not just the world around him, but the world within him. Each painting told a story of struggle, survival, and the search for meaning. When it was time for him to leave the asylum, Vincent felt a mix of fear and hope. He knew the shadows in his mind hadn't disappeared, but he also knew that as long as he could paint, he had a reason to keep going. The world may be dark, he thought, but there is always a star somewhere in the night. With his belongings packed and his brushes in hand, Vincent left Saint-Rémy. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it. He had survived the shadows before. He could do it again. And somewhere in the distance, the stars continued to shine. Chapter 9. Fields of Gold. The golden wheat fields stretched endlessly, but Vincent felt trapped within his own mind. The train rattled softly as it rolled through the countryside. Vincent van Gogh looked out the window, watching fields of wheat sway gently in the breeze. The sun bathed the land in gold, and birds soared across the sky. It was beautiful, peaceful. But inside, Vincent felt anything but peace. He had come to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small town outside Paris, hoping for a fresh start. Theo had arranged for Vincent to see a doctor named Paul Gachet, a man who understood both art and mental health. "He will take good care of you," Theo had said. Vincent nodded, though he wasn't sure care was what he needed. What he needed, perhaps, was escape from the thoughts that haunted him, the feelings that wouldn't let go. He rented a small room in a quiet inn. The walls were plain, and the bed was simple, but it didn't matter. His real home was the outdoors. As soon as he arrived, he picked up his brushes and headed into the fields. The wheat seemed endless, stretching toward the horizon like a sea of gold. It moved gently with the wind, whispering secrets Vincent longed to understand. He painted tirelessly, losing himself in the rhythms of nature. His strokes were fast, full of energy. The wheat fields, the quiet cottages, the winding roads, all of it came to life on his canvas. He painted under the sun, under the clouds, and sometimes even under the stars. His favorite time to work was early morning, when the light was soft and new. "The world feels pure then," he wrote to Theo. But even as his art flourished, the shadows in his mind deepened. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts raced, reminding him of every failure, every rejection. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping through his fingers, like grains of sand he couldn't hold on to. "Am I doing enough?" he whispered. "Will my work ever matter?" During the day, he hid these fears behind his paintings. He smiled at the villagers who passed by, nodding politely when they greeted him. But they didn't know the weight he carried. They didn't see the battles raging inside him. Only the empty room at the inn knew the truth. The nights when he cried quietly, the mornings when he struggled to get out of bed. Dr. Gachet visited him regularly, offering advice and encouragement. "You're stronger than you think," the doctor said. "Keep painting. Let your art be your medicine." Vincent tried to believe him, but the words felt far away, like echoes in a distant cave. One afternoon, he sat on a hill overlooking the wheat fields. The sun was high, and the heat wrapped around him like a blanket. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and studied the scene before him. The wheat swayed, and the sky stretched endlessly above. He began to paint, his hands moving as if guided by an invisible force. The colors were bold, yellow, green, blue, and gold. The brushstrokes were thick, almost angry, as if he were fighting the canvas itself. He finished the painting just before sunset and leaned back to admire it. But instead of pride, he felt emptiness. The beauty of the field was trapped on the canvas, but it couldn't heal him. It couldn't silence the voices that told him he was failing. He put down his brush and buried his face in his hands. "Why do I feel this way?" he thought. "Why can't I find peace?" That night, he wrote to Theo. "I am working hard," he said, "but the darkness doesn't leave me. I try to paint through it, but it always returns. I wonder, is it worth it?" Theo's reply was swift and filled with love. "You are doing more than you know," he wrote. "Your paintings are windows into your soul. One day, the world will see the beauty in them." Vincent smiled weakly as he read the letter. Theo's words warmed him, but only for a moment. His doubts were like weeds in a garden. They always grew back. As the days passed, Vincent painted more and more. His works became bolder, more emotional. He painted the village church with its tall steeple reaching toward the sky. He painted the cottages nestled along winding paths. But it was the wheat fields that drew him back again and again. There was something about their endlessness that reflected his own struggle. They were beautiful, yet untouchable. No matter how much he painted them, he couldn't capture the peace they seemed to offer. On one quiet evening, Vincent stood in the middle of a field, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with orange and pink, and the wheat shimmered like gold. But instead of comfort, Vincent felt trapped. The beauty of the world was there, right in front of him, but it didn't reach his heart. The light couldn't chase away the shadows within. He clutched his chest, breathing heavily. "I can't do this anymore," he thought. He felt like the field around him was closing in, suffocating him. The golden wheat that had once inspired him now seemed like an ocean in which he was drowning. 2 days later, Vincent left the inn with his paints and easel. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He walked past the fields, his feet carrying him toward a quiet place where the only sound was the rustling of the wheat. There, in the silence of the countryside, Vincent faced his final moment of despair. The golden fields remained, swaying gently in the breeze. The sun still shone, and the birds still sang. But Vincent van Gogh was gone. His final painting, Wheatfield with Crows, remained behind, a haunting reflection of beauty and turmoil, life and death. It was his final message, a symbol of both his struggle and his brilliance. Even after the storm in his mind had silenced him, his art would continue to speak. Chapter 10. The Final Day. A shot rang out across the field, and everything fell silent. It was a warm afternoon in late July 1890. The fields of Auvers-sur-Oise shimmered under the summer sun. Vincent van Gogh walked slowly along the familiar path, his hands gripping his paint box and easel. The golden wheat surrounded him, swaying gently in the breeze. But today, the sight didn't bring him peace. His steps were heavy, his heart burdened with despair. He had painted this landscape many times, the vast fields, the crows circling above, the endless sky. But today, something was different. The weight of his thoughts pressed down on him like a dark cloud. His dreams, his struggles, his failures, all of it overwhelmed him. He couldn't escape the feeling that his work, no matter how passionate, was not enough. He reached a quiet spot, far from the village. The only sounds were the rustle of the wheat and the distant chirping of birds. He set down his easel, but didn't open his paints. Instead, he pulled a small pistol from his coat. His hands trembled as he lifted it. Tears blurred his vision. "I can't go on," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes. The shot echoed across the field. The birds scattered into the sky, startled by the noise. Vincent fell to the ground, clutching his chest. The pain was sharp, but the bullet had not killed him. He lay there for a moment, his breath shallow, his mind spinning. The golden wheat surrounded him like a sea. He could feel its softness against his skin as he struggled to sit up. Somehow, with incredible strength, he made it back to the inn where he was staying. The innkeeper saw him stumble through the door, his clothes stained with blood. "What happened?" the man asked, panic in his voice. Vincent didn't answer. He simply collapsed. A doctor was called, but there was little he could do. The bullet had lodged deep in Vincent's body. Moving him would only make things worse. The doctor bandaged his wound, trying to ease the bleeding, but he knew the truth. Vincent didn't have much time. Word reached Theo in Paris, and he rushed to his brother's side. When he arrived, Vincent lay in bed, pale and weak. His breath came in short gasps, and sweat covered his forehead. But when he saw Theo, his eyes softened. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "Theo," he whispered. Theo sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. "I'm here," he said. His voice trembled. "I'm not leaving you." The room was silent except for the sound of Vincent's labored breathing. Outside, the evening sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the window. Vincent turned his head slightly, looking at the light. "The fields," he murmured. "They were so beautiful today." Theo wiped a tear from his cheek. "They'll always be beautiful, Vincent, because of you." For 2 days, Vincent lay in that bed, slipping in and out of consciousness. He spoke softly at times, talking about his paintings, the colors he loved, and the dreams he had once believed in. "I tried so hard," he said. "I wanted to give something to the world." Theo squeezed his hand. "You did," he replied. "More than you know." On the evening of July 29th, Vincent took his final breath. His eyes closed, and the room grew still. Theo held him tightly, his tears falling onto the bed. "Goodbye, Vincent," he whispered. "I'll make sure the world remembers you." The news of Vincent's death spread quickly through the village. Some people shook their heads, calling him the mad painter who had finally gone too far. Others, those who had seen his paintings and felt their power, mourned the loss of a man whose talent had been misunderstood. Theo, devastated by grief, made arrangements for Vincent's funeral. It was a small, quiet ceremony held in the same countryside Vincent had loved so much. His coffin was covered in sunflowers, his favorite flower. The golden petals seemed to glow under the summer sun, a final tribute to the man who had captured their beauty on canvas. Theo stood by the grave long after the others had left. His heart ached, not just for the brother he had lost, but for the world that hadn't seen Vincent's brilliance. "They will," he promised. "I'll make sure they see what you saw." True to his word, Theo worked tirelessly to promote Vincent's art. He showed Vincent's paintings to galleries, collectors, and critics. He shared the letters they had written to each other, giving the world a glimpse into Vincent's mind and heart. But Theo's own health began to fail. Just 6 months after Vincent's death, he passed away, unable to carry the burden of grief any longer. But their story didn't end there. Theo's wife, Johanna, picked up where her husband had left off. She dedicated her life to sharing Vincent's work and letters with the world. Slowly, people began to understand the genius they had ignored during his life. His paintings, once seen as strange and chaotic, were now celebrated as masterpieces. Today, Vincent van Gogh is remembered as one of the greatest artists in history. His works, from the Starry Night to Sunflowers to Wheat Field with Crows, hang in the most prestigious museums. Millions of people admire the colors, the emotion, and the passion he poured into every brushstroke. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies not just in the art he created, but in the resilience he showed. Even in his darkest moments, he kept painting. Even when no one believed in him, he believed in his work. As the sun sets over the fields of Auvers-sur-Oise, the golden wheat still sways in the breeze, whispering stories of a man who saw the world differently and helped others see it too. Chapter 11. The World Remembers. For years, Vincent's paintings were hidden away, but the world would not forget. After Vincent van Gogh's death, the small town of Auvers-sur-Oise returned to its quiet routine. The fields he had painted stood unchanged, the crows circling just as they always had. But something was different. The man who'd once roamed those fields, capturing their spirit with bold brushstrokes, was gone. His paintings, scattered across Theo's collection and a few forgotten galleries, sat in silence, waiting. Theo, overwhelmed by grief and illness, passed away just 6 months after his brother. He had always been Vincent's strongest supporter, and with him gone, it seemed Vincent's work would be lost to time. But someone else was ready to take up the fight. Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh Bonger, held Vincent's paintings in her hands and knew she had a mission. She opened the letters Vincent had written to Theo. As she read them, she felt his passion come alive again. The struggles, the dreams, and the moments of pure inspiration. Tears filled her eyes as she realized how much her husband and Vincent had shared. People need to see this, she thought. They need to know who Vincent was. With determination, Johanna began organizing exhibitions of Vincent's art. At first, it wasn't easy. Many people still saw his work as strange, chaotic, and unimportant. Critics called his thick brushstrokes childish and said his colors were too wild. But Johanna didn't give up. She believed in the power of his paintings, just as Theo had. She displayed his works in small galleries, explaining the stories behind them. She shared his letters with the public, allowing them to see the man behind the canvas. Slowly, opinions began to change. People who once dismissed Vincent's art now saw the emotion in his sunflowers, the loneliness in his wheat fields, and the hope in his starry skies. One of Vincent's first major exhibitions was held in Paris in 1901. just 11 years after his death. People gathered in front of his paintings, amazed by the colors and movement. Some were moved to tears. "How did we miss this?" one man whispered. Others nodded in agreement, as if they, too, had only just discovered the beauty Vincent had left behind. As the years passed, Vincent's reputation continued to grow. His paintings traveled across Europe, inspiring a new generation of artists. His use of color, light, and texture was unlike anything they had seen before. Painters like Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso studied his work, marveling at his ability to create emotion through simple strokes. But it wasn't just artists who were drawn to Vincent's story. Ordinary people found comfort and inspiration in his struggles. His letters revealed a man who had faced rejection, loneliness, and inner demons, but never stopped creating. His persistence became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that beauty can grow even in the darkest places. In 1914, Johanna made one final gesture of love and respect. She arranged for Theo's body to be exhumed and reburied next to Vincent in the cemetery at Auvers-sur-Oise. Now, the brothers who had shared so much in life would rest side by side, their graves marked by simple stones surrounded by ivy and sunflowers. Johanna's efforts didn't stop there. She published Vincent's letters, ensuring that future generations could understand his thoughts, struggles, and dreams. The letters became a key part of his legacy, offering insight into his mind and soul. They showed that his art wasn't just about landscapes or flowers. It was about life itself, in all its beauty and pain. By the mid-20th century, Vincent van Gogh had become a household name. His paintings, once ridiculed, were now among the most famous in the world. The starry night, sunflowers, and wheat field with crows were displayed in museums visited by millions of people. His works fetched prices at auctions that he could never have imagined during his lifetime. But for many, Vincent's story was about more than money or fame. It was a story of perseverance, creativity, and the power of vision. His art spoke to those who felt misunderstood, those who had been told they weren't good enough, and those who struggled to find their place in the world. In 1973, the Van Gogh Museum opened in Amsterdam, thanks to Johanna's son, Vincent van Gogh. It housed hundreds of Vincent's works, making them accessible to the public. Visitors walked through the galleries, standing in awe before the swirling skies and vibrant flowers. Many of them whispered the same question: how did one man create so much beauty? Even today, Vincent's legacy continues to grow. His paintings inspire books, films, and exhibitions. His life story reminds us that success doesn't always happen overnight, and that the greatest contributions to the world often come from those who struggle the most. His art, filled with love, sorrow, and hope, continues to touch hearts around the globe. As the sun sets over the fields of Auvers-sur-Oise, the golden wheat still dances in the wind. The crows still fly across the sky. But now, they are no longer just part of the landscape. They are part of a story the world will never forget. Chapter 12. A Starry Legacy. Vincent van Gogh's star shines brighter than ever, inspiring artists and dreamers across the globe. The night sky stretches endlessly above, filled with glowing stars. This is the same sky that Vincent van Gogh once painted, swirling, vibrant, and full of emotion. Though his life ended more than a century ago, the light of his legacy still burns, guiding artists and dreamers across the world. His story is not just about art. It is about resilience, passion, and the search for meaning. During his lifetime, Vincent was often misunderstood. His paintings, filled with bold colors and thick brushstrokes, confused many people. Critics mocked him. Buyers ignored him. He sold only one painting before his death. But Vincent kept going. Even when the world rejected him, he never stopped creating. His letters reveal why. "I feel alive when I paint," he wrote. "Without it, I am nothing." That drive, creating not for fame, but because he had to, resonates with countless artists today. Painters, musicians, writers, and filmmakers see themselves in Vincent's struggles. His journey reminds them that failure is not the end. "He teaches us that beauty can be born from pain," said one modern artist. Vincent's life proves that passion is worth pursuing, even when no one else believes in you. But Vincent's influence goes beyond individual artists. His work changed the way the world sees art. In the late 19th century, most people believed paintings should look realistic. Artists were expected to capture every detail perfectly. But Vincent believed in something deeper. He painted how things felt, not just how they looked. His wheat fields weren't just landscapes. They were symbols of life's struggles and victories. His starry skies weren't just beautiful. They were filled with hope and mystery. Today, art students learn about Vincent as a pioneer of expression. Without him, movements like Fauvism, Expressionism, and even modern abstract art might not exist. Henri Matisse once said, "If Van Gogh hadn't painted the way he did, we wouldn't have the freedom we have now." His influence runs like a thread through the fabric of modern creativity. Beyond the art world, Vincent's legacy touches ordinary people who may have never held a paintbrush. His life speaks to anyone who has ever felt different or lost. His letters, filled with raw emotion, offer comfort to those struggling with mental health. "I am in pain," he once admitted, "but I still believe in the power of creating something meaningful." That belief, despite suffering, has given courage to millions. His painting, The Starry Night, has become more than a work of art. It's a universal symbol of wonder, mystery, and resilience. People hang prints of it in their homes, not just because it's beautiful, but because it speaks to something deeper. The swirling sky reminds them that chaos can be beautiful, that even when life feels out of control, there is light in the darkness. In museums around the world, visitors stand silently before his works, as if in conversation with the man who painted them. Some cry, some smile, and some simply stand still, lost in thought. They see themselves in his portraits, his fields of wheat, and his humble sunflowers. "It's as if he painted for all of us," one visitor said. "He understood what it means to feel deeply." Even in popular culture, Vincent's star shines brightly. Songs like Don McLean's Vincent, Starry, Starry Night, pay tribute to the artist's life. Films, books, and documentaries tell his story, each one uncovering a new layer of his genius. His name has become a symbol of perseverance, creativity, and the importance of seeing the world through your own unique lens. But perhaps the most touching part of Vincent's legacy is the message he left for future generations. Through his work and his words, he tells us, even if you feel invisible, even if no one understands you now, your light still matters. His story teaches us that success isn't always immediate. Sometimes it comes long after we are gone. At the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, thousands of visitors walk through the galleries every day. They see the potato eaters, sunflowers, and wheat field with crows up close. They read his letters, written with honesty and vulnerability. Many leave the museum changed, feeling closer to a man who, in his own time, was an outsider. As the sun sets over the fields of Auvers-sur-Oise, Vincent's final resting place, his grave, remains simple. Next to him lies Theo, the brother who never gave up on him. Their graves are covered with sunflowers, placed by visitors from around the world. Some leave notes, thanking Vincent for showing them that even in sadness, beauty can grow. Vincent van Gogh's legacy is not just in the paintings that hang in museums. It's in the hearts of people who see the world differently because of him. It's in the courage of artists who continue to create despite rejection. It's in the quiet strength of those who, like Vincent, carry the weight of mental illness, but refuse to let it define them. As the stars shine brightly in the night sky, Vincent's spirit lives on. His story reminds us that even when the world seems dark, there is always light. His art speaks a language that needs no translation. It says, keep going, keep creating, keep dreaming. Because sometimes the brightest stars are the ones that take the longest to be seen.